Okay, thank you everyone for coming tonight. You're here. Greg Wilson's Discotheque Archives book launch, and we're going to do a little chat talking to the two special guest DJs we've got here tonight, which is Colin Curtis and Trevor M, two Stoke-on-Trent bona fide DJ legends.
But nobody wants to come this close.
They're the comfy seats as well. Just wanted to start off really, just asking first Colin and then obviously moving on to Trevor. Just tell us a little bit about the very, very first, if you like, step towards DJing from being like a youth on the dance floor or just interested in music and then taking the next step to collecting records and wanting to play them to people.
Blimey, how long have we got? When I started collecting records in the early 60s, and I just had a complete impulsive need to share the music that I was listening to. The more I listened to pirate radio, the more I learnt about American music. I felt that this was a minority sport, so the only way I could spread that was to share it with other people. Lucky enough to go to grammar school, I think my grandfather sorted that out. It certainly wasn't anything to do with my academic skills. But whilst I was there, I mean, some of my favourite acts from the 60s and so on, I mean, Hendrix was massive for me, but that music just caught me, and we set up a mobile disco, myself and a guy called Ian Turner, who's no longer with us, but he was prolific in working locally with myself. We had a disco called Dr. Soul, and we played at the Wolverhampton Grammar School dinner dance, the annual dance. And we had the letters D-R-S-O-U-L. And they were just individual letters. And some clever fella came along and he pinched the letter D. So we played all night with arsehole written on the decks. So I thought, if we've got through that, then we're in with a chance. And so it was then, I used to go to what was then the Crystal Ballroom and hang around cause as much nuisance as I could, until eventually in 1967 they signed me and gave me a Thursday night soul night, as long as I did the commercial Saturday and commercial Thursday as it was then. Sorry, Thursday was commercial. They gave me that as a soul night if I did the other nights commercially. So that gave me the opportunity. At that time, soul music in Stoke-on-Trent was about, as much as people would like to think it was about Motown, it wasn't for us. The underground scene was much more about the heavier sound of soul, Stax, Atlantic. So Sam and Dave, you just got Otis Redding, that kind of music on those labels. And I also, with the mobile disco, we were lucky enough to work with people like Emperor Roscoe. So we got access to more and more information about where to get American records, and the beginning of my, and still got it unfortunately, my need to know too much.
I'd like to ask obviously the same question for Trevor. Obviously it's going to be a few years after Colin, but obviously I think you were more on the dance floor.
Cheeky that is.
You progressed from the dance floor more to sort of the DJ booth. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Trevor?
I think when my actual journey started was probably around 72. My first sort of experience of listening to what was coming out of America, believe it or not, was not coming out of a radio in the UK. Because I don't know if there's anybody any old enough to remember it, we used to have one of them TVs which had 4 channels on, and the thing was on the side of the wall, and you had 4 channels, and that was it. So my experience of sort of stuff that was coming out of America, the first time I got on a plane to Jamaica, and obviously it's quite a long flight, so the way that they entertained us was some of the music that was coming through. We didn't have TVs or monitors, and some of the music that was listening to on the radio was never listened to anything like that. If you bear in mind that at that particular time, 72, 74, I was brought up on a diet of glam rock, sweet, and mud, that kind of thing, the Glitter Band, and that was what we got. And I think my experience from them, as soon as I got off that plane, I was really very, very interested in what was going on. I needed to find out more about that type of style of music. We had a little radio cassette. Luckily enough, we were able to pick up Luxembourg on a Sunday night and keep it down quiet because my dad was in the other room. And some of the music that I was experiencing from there, I said, I need to be a part of that. So we just needed to find out sort of where I could purchase all this music. And I think the journey started then. I then found out about local gigs, one being with my friend here, Colin, down at Tiffany's, and went down there. Them guys just took it to another level. And I think from then on, my diet and my music background, I just stuck with it, and I just needed to have it.
I think this is obviously a good time to bring Greg in here. I'll ask you some questions about obviously your relationship with the guys over the years, certainly back in the day, but obviously your book, which is an amazing book, obviously. Tell us a little bit more about it, Greg.
Well, it started off as a monthly column for DJ magazine. They'd approached me to do something on a more historic basis, and rather than pick one subject over 2 pages, I decided on this format of 4 different subjects to fill the 2 pages, which gave me a certain word count, so I had to get all the information in a compact way. And I chose like classic DJ, classic record, classic label, and classic venue. Everything in the book is pre-rave. I didn't want to write about the rave scene because there's been so much written about it and everything. And there were so many gaps about what had come before that I felt that needed the focus. So I did this series for DJ Magazine. We took it up to, I think it was 25 issues, so just over 2 years. And that got to 100 pieces with the 4 different sections. And then I put it to bed from there. But within my mind, I wanted to turn that into a book. I always thought it'd work as a book, and the illustrations in it by Pete Fowler of the DJs were really great, you know. And what I wanted to do as well, I was aware that with the DJ magazine audience, it was a younger audience. And I didn't want it to be this kind of stiff black and white history kind of lesson. I wanted it to be colourful and vibrant, with the vibrancy of the people that were there, that were youthful people at the time. And I think this is where the illustrations of the DJs was great, because I think as Paul Murphy said, you know, when he saw his illustration, it was like forever young, you know. It's like locking you in the time when, you know, you were the most vital and things were happening in these various scenes that predate what happened with Raven House. So in lockdown, decided to put the book out as a limited edition paperback, and I really, you know, hoped I'd sell 500 would have been amazing. You know, I think the first run we did was 300. Just put it up on sale, and the orders just flooded in. And in the end, because I advertised it as a limited edition, we had to kind of cap it, and we did 1,600, I think, in the end of that first run, and then stopped it. So the intention then was to extend it further, to bring in 20 new sections, to also put it out as a hardback. And so 2 years on, that's exactly what happened. So this year it's been available. You know, again, we've had great response to it, great sales and everything. And yeah, it's now kind of out there and available. We've got copies tonight. If you want to buy one later, we can sell you on there. I can sign it for you if you want. Quite happy to do that. So yeah, I mean, what it does though is it's a web. This whole culture of ours, and I mean, the book covers a lot of what was going on in the UK, and that's like a big difference to a lot of other stuff. It covers a lot of what was happening in the US as well. But these two lineages are completely different, you know, dating back to Colin, what he's talking about in the 60s in Stoke. There was no influence from US DJ culture at all. And yet, you know, like we had scenes like the Twisted Wheel in Manchester, and the scene in London, and the Roaring Twenties where Count Suckle was. And these were all happening, and these were setting the foundation of what would later become the black music scenes in the UK. And, you know, the import channels opening, what Colin's talking about there, initially DJs finding this music, like yourself, Trevor, and how do I get this music? Now you realise you've got to get it from America. How do you do that? Certain people have been onto this and they've opened up certain import channels and they're selling mail order, or eventually they're opening shops up. And so it all evolves from that, this kind of obsession with black American music that's emerged in this country for a multitude of reasons, I suppose.
I think, obviously, with the success you've had over the last sort of 20 years, Greg, where you've relaunched your DJ career and obviously you've played festivals and clubs all over the world, it's intriguing for a lot of people who are, you know, clubbers and people who are interested in current music. Your views on the likes of Trevor and Colin, because obviously, you know, you remember them from the 80s and what they were doing, like the soul all-dayers, and obviously the club culture they were involved in back then. I'd like to hear your first memories of these guys.
Well, Trevor, I mean, he was involved in the same scene, which Colin was also involved in, the jazz funk scene, as we called it. Now, it wasn't just jazz funk, you know, it was also like the kind of black side of disco music. It was funk, it was soul, it was the best of black American music generally, although there was bits from elsewhere available. And this scene kind of evolved. It's all-dayers. And this is how I know Trevor, from the all-dayers scene, because he was doing the place here in Stoke. I'd heard about it, we'd read about it. We had kids coming down to Wigan Pier, where I played, from Stoke. So things were interconnected in that way, but everybody came together at the all-dayers. And I mean, it was great because, like, to be involved in this scene, as a lot of people here will know, you had to be a little bit off the beaten track. There were only certain radio shows. If you didn't read Blues and Soul magazine, you know, it was hard to find out what was going on unless you knew where to look. And so, like, the all-day scene, what it did was brought everybody together in a kind of mutual kind of sense. And so you had Colin's crowd coming from wherever he was playing at the time, Trevor bringing the people across from Stoke, people like Jonathan in Nottingham, you know, and all these people came into a venue, and then it cross-pollinated because there were conversations, and somebody said, you know, oh, there's this great club in Derby, and so somebody from Manchester goes over to Derby the next week to experience that. People travelled round and experienced these clubs. So Trevor we'd cross paths lots of times at different all-dayers that were happening in places like Sheffield, Birmingham, you know, like Leeds, these kind of places. So that's how I know Trevor. Colin, of course, when I came onto the jazz funk scene in the Northwest, I had a Tuesday night at Wigan Pier, which I'd inherited. It turned out to be a big night, and I later took over the Wednesday at Legend, which eventually became the main hub of what was the emerging electro-funk scene at the time. So it was a kind of turbulent period as the music was changing around, and Colin, I didn't know, I'd never met him from the northern side, I was never a part of the northern soul scene.
I've never seen him till tonight.
And, you know, even at that point, he was like revered. You know, the other DJs on the scene had a reverence for Colin that, you know, was recognisable, whereas my background didn't come from a northern soul place. It came from Liverpool, which was very much a funk city at the time. There was a club called The Timepiece with Les Spain, so it was a gritty kind of funk vibe, and that's what I grew up on, you know, your Parliaments and Brass Constructions and these things coming through. And so the northern soul side of it, although I was always fascinated and intrigued with it, I was never a part of it. So, you know, learning about how Colin had come out of that scene, and Ian Levine as well, and they branched off into different territories, Colin taking the jazz funk and developing that very much so in the North and Midlands in lots of ways. And at the same time, you know, like, this scene was something that we all clicked into, and it began to mushroom and emerge and become important. I mean, Ian Levine, by the way, of course, went on to Heaven, and the biggest gay club in the country, and he became the man behind High Energy and everything. So these two trajectories that came away from Northern Soul and came into different areas, you know, they set the foundation in many respects for what was happening in the North during that period. So Colin was, you know, we didn't know how to take you at the time, Colin. You know, you were a kind of larger than life character even then. I mean, what are you, 7 or 8 years, 6 or 7 years older than I am. I was the upstart kid that had come on the scene, that was bringing into play these electronic records, and there was a lot of resistance to that at the time. And so, you know, in many ways, in fact, when I stopped DJing at the end of '83, for many years, I thought Colin didn't have much time for me at all. Because people used to always say, you know, like, wait till Colin hears about this. They kind of say, you're playing this music, don't know what Colin will think of this. So I used to get this a lot. So I always was under this kind of assumption that maybe, but later, you know, I learned that what Colin was doing at Rock City with Jonathan was very much in line with what was happening at Legend and when we compare as well, you know, with bringing the more electronic sound through. And that then, you know, again, it shows about what Colin is. He's always been progressive. He's gone through the Northern Soul scene. He's evolved the jazz funk scene. And the one side of it that people don't really recognize so much was that he was you know, at the germination of house music in the UK, at the Playpen in Manchester, when Foot Patrol were dancing, before people even called it house music. It was just another form of electro that come from Chicago. And so you were there like at the foundation of that. And I don't know any DJ, you know, I can't think of any DJ anywhere that was, you know, so important within 3 separate musical scenes. So, you know, you've got to take your hat off to Colin Curtis.
Great words there, Greg. I mean, just going back to obviously Colin, it's been much documented, and I don't want to really sort of spend all night asking you loads of questions about Northern Soul and, you know, the big part that you played there, and it was a big part. What I do want to ask you, obviously, it's quite well documented, the sort of schism between the sort of the soul side of it and you wanting to play more modern records. Obviously, you got quite a backlash from that. What were your thoughts at the time about it?
I suppose my thoughts were the same as they always are, that when you've started to do something that's become successful, the most crucial part of DJing is trust with the people. In those days, it was resident clubs, so people would come into your club. They'd come back if they enjoyed it. So you built up a trust with the audience. And so when the music started to change in America, beginning of the 70s, a lot of James Brown, a lot of ballads, that was the way to get on American radio. But then late 73, it went back to dance music, and it went back to what eventually became disco. But I started to feature dance records along with, brand new records, along with the Northern Soul classics. And they, for me, just became the predominant force. And I can take criticism. If I'm the only person left in the club each week, then okay, I'm wrong, but I'm still here. I'm nearly 40 now. Some of you don't know that. So the transition for me was never difficult, because musically, I was listening to 60s soul music in the 60s. In the 60s in Newcastle-under-Lyme, on a Tuesday night, you could go and see Billy Preston, you could go and see Fontella Bass, you could go and see Doris Troy, you could go and see Sam and Dave. This is on a Tuesday night. I look at this city now, well, it isn't a city, but I look at the towns. We were so spoilt back then, because you've got the back end of most clubs surviving because they put live acts on, but this is on a Tuesday night in Newcastle-under-Lyme, Jackie Wilson live. You couldn't make that up. But with the music progression, as Northern Soul, went through to the Twisted Wheel, which was probably the original Northern Soul, which ironically came from Liverpool. You're the guy who came over and affected the music, started to play R&B, because he was booking R&B acts to play there. Muddy Waters, a lot of the blues boys were playing there. So the Twisted Wheel developed what was first termed as Northern Soul. And then my local club, I was signed to Tiffany's, but my local club and the inside of my head was the Golden Torch in Tunstall, where we could just We had free range on the music. Again, the acts were there, Inez and Charlie Fox, Junior Walker and the All-Stars, you know, and to be able to talk to these people and play with these people, Edwin Starr. I even spent time with Christian Perfect from Chicken Shack. She played there on a Wednesday night, maybe 30 people there, you know, I mean, in those early days. Amen Corner, Small Faces, they all did the torch. So it was a mixture of all those things, but as that developed into the all-nighters, the 13 months of Torch all-nighters in Tunstall were probably the most adrenaline-filled musical 13 months of my life. Never experienced it. The tempo had gone up. The kids just went for it. We got 900 people in a 450 capacity club. And that was incredible. And then after that closed, again, the police... I don't like people who take drugs, particularly police officers and customs officers. But if... At that time, you know, that was the way it was. In the local paper, we were advised by Mecca organisation to leave the torch before it hit the papers, or else we would get sacked from the Mecca as well. So Keith Minshall and myself, Keith Minshall was my original inspiration on the Northern Soul from living in Kidsgrove as kids. But I then was booked to play Blackpool Mecca, and after 12 months, it was the end of '73, and that was the beginning of a change in musical sound in America, and I absolutely loved it. So we changed, we were able to adapt the music there because it was an 8 till 2 club, low roof, all the speakers on the dance floor, and we were just able to break this new music, which, yeah, there's always push back against change. I play dance floor jazz, push back against that. I played house music in Manchester, pushed back against that. What's this crap? What you doing? Why don't you get your hair cut? What's that got to do with it? You know, it's, for me, black music, for the kid who's grown up in Stoke-on-Trent, working class, I don't know why I've got this passion, but it won't go. I'm 70 years old now, but I continue each week to hear fantastic music, and I want to share it.
Wow. Obviously, you had a lot of gigs outside of Stoke-on-Trent throughout your career in the 80s. And obviously, I know Trevor equally had gigs outside the area, but I think for a lot of people from Stoke-on-Trent, we all think you were the resident DJ, obviously the basement. And there's a lot of fascination locally, particularly with the crowd who are house music fans now, but we've got a huge love for black music, pre-house music. Tell us just a few of your memories from those basement days and what it felt like to be, if you like, the big kingpin really in Stoke-on-Trent with regards to DJ culture and music back then.
I think the basement story went, I actually got in there by default. Somebody was off sick, and I was doing a residency down in Burslem at the George Hotel, and they asked me would I come up and do the Saturday night. I'd already been in there and experienced the night in there, but it was more commercially driven down in the basement. And what I was doing, obviously I was going to all days all around the country, experiencing the American side, and I wanted to put more of a tougher edge to it. The disco was very prominent at that time, back in late 1979, and also it was getting funky as well. The people that used to come down into the basement, I didn't really think too much about at that particular time. I think anything that I put on, people were very receptive, and I just loved the music, and I was lucky that I was getting taught about locally and also regionally, where people were visiting us from Manchester, from Liverpool, from London. The music that we were playing, they'd heard nothing like it before. And the stuff that was coming out of America at the time, I was just looking and said, what else can I add to the table, bring to the table, and see whether these people will jump on the journey with me. I went through what can I call it, the disco, the soul, the jazz funk, a lot of the underground music that was coming out. The electro came on board. When we were playing some of the electro, I was probably in my mid-20s, but there was another generation coming through, and the emergence of the electro sound, the younger generation at that particular time, we want to hear more of this, So we were very, how can I put it, very progressive in the music that we were listening, the music that we were playing to the local punters, and I think that rubbed off on a lot of people. We had 10 good years out of the basement from 79 to probably late 88, when eventually they closed the venue down. But through that time, the journey with regards to the style of the music that we were playing in the basement, I was just completely gobsmacked. And you don't think of it at the time. I was just completely gobsmacked by the amount of people that get in contact with me through Facebook, through social media channels, and say, can you remember this, can you remember this? And yeah, it puts a little sparkle in my eye with regards to what we did and what we achieved. I think from that as well, it also got me noticed and on the all-day circuit. And my very first one that took me out to Staffordshire was at the Palais in Nottingham. And
Was that the Shack Attack one, was it?
no, I-Tension one.
Yes.
And what a place. The sound system in there completely blew me away. I was on about 5 o'clock in the evening.
Mecca organisation was leading in the UK for sound systems. I mean, we even had quadraphonic sound in Newcastle Tiffany's. Quadraphonic sound. So if you stood in that one place that it was effective, it was fantastic. The rest of it was a bag of shite because it didn't work. But just to give this man a little bit more, the place organisation was run by a bunch of clowns. It was run by people who just wanted to make money and play commercial music, as Trevor said. For a black guy to get in there and play black music was incredible. You know, what he achieved locally, you know, in a club that was, you know, you couldn't have white trousers one week, you couldn't have tight trousers the next week. There was all these ways and means that people got round to get in.
Well, here's one for you, Colin. I don't know whether there's anyone in here that can actually remember that the fellas couldn't dance
On their own.
on the dance floor.
I stood in for you, and 3 records in, this bouncer came, he said, stop the music. I said, what do you mean, stop the music? He said, there's guys here dancing on their own. I said, you're kidding? Dancing on their own, blokes? I said, we can't have that, can we? I said, well, I'll get myself off until you sort it out. But I mean, eventually they allowed that you could go on in couples. It just got ridiculous. But I mean, that really, for me, epitomised the organisation. The interviews I went to work there were farcical, and I couldn't work in that environment because Mecca organisation, for all its supposed rigidity, allowed me to do exactly what I wanted.
I think one of the things that we found as things changed at the place, and what I found, I didn't realise at the time, I was lucky enough to get myself a residency at the place, but one of the difficulties at that particular time is to get into another venue and sell yourself. One of the things with regards to a lot of the people that used to frequent the clubs they used to work at, they didn't drink quite a lot. So if you see some of the old flyers, we were charging anything like 50 pence or £1 to get in. Some of the bar managers used to come back to you and says, we can't make any money out of that. It says, what we take on the door, we probably wouldn't make that much on the bar. I didn't take that into consideration. All I was interested at the time was just about the music and the people getting in here. But I didn't realise that that's what I was up against. And obviously there was an element of sort of, I think as time went on, you get noticed by different venues. Will he come and do this for us? Will he conduct it? So it made it a bit easier, but in the early years it was very, very difficult.
Obviously, one thing I do want to touch on is obviously records. It was really the only medium back then. Obviously, there's loads of different mediums now, particularly obviously with the birth of digital. But back then, your record shopping, your record buying, you know, how much of a big deal was that for you? Because I know obviously getting them records first before any other DJ was really where everyone was chasing. You know, tell me a little bit more about your record collecting and buying back then.
Absolutely mental. It was a case of getting into spinning before Colin did. And still you didn't get it.
Wouldn't have made any difference.
No, seriously, my record collecting probably started up at Manchester Spinning. Obviously there was one or two of the local shops when some of the bits coming through, but predominantly what we used to purchase years ago was imports. And some of these imports are coming through, we were looking for tracks. Some of the album tracks were coming through, you were buying an album, an import album, which I can't remember, it's probably about $10.99, and you're buying it just for one track. And that was just for the love. But my wife to this day does not know how much I used to spend every single week. All she does know is she said I never used to buy any clothes. But I can honestly say at one time, and Colin will vouch for me this, I didn't have a car at the time. I wouldn't invest in a car, so I used to jump on the train first thing in the morning. On a Saturday morning, my wife was working, so I used to take my young lad up with me, and I'd be stood outside spinning at 9 o'clock in the morning, making sure I got the pick of what was the best. At that particular time, I found out Colin used to have his private package and stored in the corner, and probably Greg did as well. But the other thing, with regards to sort of the music, I used to spend a lot of money on music, and I used to go to spinning in Manchester, used to go to Wolverhampton, Birmingham, London, just to get a different slant, because if you can imagine, you've got the buyers from them shops and you're relying on what they are buying for what your output is going to be at the weekend. So my outputs, okay, we overlapped with a lot of the music that we got, but I needed to have sort of the odd one or two that nobody else had, or I'd picked up from somebody down in Bristol, sort of play this at the weekend, and that just made a difference to my set at the weekend when I was doing it all day. I spent a lot of money on music. I don't regret one bit of it. I've still got a large proportion of my music at home. Some of it has had a fair bit of wear and tear. Me and Colin were talking about it a few months back, and sometimes when people have asked me, will you come out and do a vinyl set? I couldn't rely on that.
I'm like that. I don't take vinyl.
I've just got this picture of a full dance floor, and I've got a track on, and then all of a sudden it jumps, and that would just break my heart on the dance floor. So that's where I am at. But the music, everything that comes through, we take anything on board. Soul, R&B, house, we just had to have that track that we could sort of put out there to the dancing public. And do you know what? There was a big underground scene out there at one time. What a lot of people don't realise, when All Dayers first started off, I was part of that scene as a dancer, and I used to catch a train at about 10:30 down at Longport train station to go to Birmingham, and be stood outside the Locarno at 11:45 waiting to go in with a change of clothes, handed this bag, and we used to get in there and get in the Bally High, and I tell you what, there's probably about 100 people in there. What an amazing afternoon that we had in there. The music was just so underground you couldn't believe, and I just wanted to take it all in.
Could I just add something about what you were saying about the record buying and how vital that was, that you could get the music, because it was an upfront scene. It was all about you playing music ahead of the next person, you know, and because it was so refined by that point, there were nights that were just purely imports, that was, like you're saying, really underground nights. And I remember, like, from my side with spinning, that I had a run-in in 81. I just started Legend. I'd been doing Wigan Pier residency and everything. And it was, one night was at Legend, Wednesday night, some kid came in, Arthur Adams, you got the floor. And I went, don't know him. And they said, oh yeah, it's great, they played it at the main event last night, or whatever. It's the biggest tune. So I'm like, God, why didn't he get a copy of this for me? So I phoned spinning the next day, Arthur Adams, you got, yeah. Got more copies coming in at the weekend. Okay. At the weekend went, haven't got any copies in yet. Didn't have the copies in. I had to go in the second week with no Arthur Adams. And, you know, at this point, you know, it's like embarrassing. So somebody comes up to me again, Arthur Adams, you got the floor. So, I haven't got a copy. Oh, I've got a copy in the car. And I was like...
It was my spare.
I was like, when did you get that? Oh, I got it the other day from spinning. And I really saw my arse over it completely. And at the time, because I did the residency at Wigan Pier, the club bought their own records as well. So I bought records, and the club bought records. So at that moment, you know, we were like one of the biggest customers of spinning in terms of how much we were buying. And I went in and asked to see Gary, you know, I went straight to Gary Lane, who was the owner of the shop, and basically said to him, look, this cannot happen. I will go to London every week and buy my records there, but I cannot be left without, you know, these tracks. And that's what changed it. That's when they did start to kind of bag stuff up as well and make sure that you were looked after. And it was so vital, because if I couldn't have competed in that way because I couldn't get hold of tracks, I wouldn't have lasted 10 minutes, you know. They would have kicked me out of Manchester for not having the biggest track. So it was a kind of little battle. I mean, I was the young kid then. I was a bit of an upstart. I was probably, you know, he's a bit brash. He's like, you know, got his own ideas about things. And so, you know, I had to kind of fight my corner in that way. And I always had a relationship with spinning that was very tricky, especially with Kev, because Kev hated electro and let everybody know, and even put charts in the window, electro shit, and, you know, he despised it. And so I was, you know, I had this, but at the same time, Kev had like one of the main all-dayers, which was Clouds in Preston, and had to book me, because if he didn't book me, he's going to lose a percentage of his audience who are going to be brought in on coaches. So it was, you know, it was like a dysfunctional family, you know. I mean, Frank Elson, you bring him into the equation, and I respect all these people, and everyone was coming from the same place with a love of black music, but with a different context and a different perspective on what was going on.
Now, obviously, the record thing, I'm glad it's come last to you, Colin, because obviously Stoke-on-Trent DJ sort of growing up, sort of house music time. Your record collection, even back then, was legendary. I mean, I get the feeling that there was very little you didn't buy that you were into. How does that work financially? Because obviously records not cheap.
It's called theft. It doesn't work financially. You know, I mean, I don't fly, or else I could work in, even tomorrow, maybe 7, 8 different countries. I've never flown, I'm never going to fly. No real explanation for that. There's obviously something mentally wrong with me, but record collecting became an obsession for me. So if I do something, I don't do it, I can't just, you know, yeah, that one's okay, that one's okay. Even in the 60s, when Action Records started to release records in the UK, which for American records released in the UK, I bought every record on the label. House music, every record on New Groove, every record on Strictly Rhythm. Not what people considered to be the good ones, but it had to be every record. So I accumulated something in the region of 70, 80,000 records. You know, right back to Northern Soul, whatever it was. And I mean, nowadays I come out with a little case and I've got 20,000 records in a bag with the headphones. You know, I'm not obsessed with vinyl. Vinyl was the only way to get the music back then. What Greg's describing was very much part of the scene. But for me, it was massively important part of the scene, because although, you know, people trying to climb over each other to get that track or to have that track first, without that motivation, without that continual movement, it would have just stagnated. People would have just sort of, oh yeah, we'll just play the same records we played last week. And so, in a way, it had a massively positive effect, and people did want those records. I mean, you mentioned that today. I mean, I can pick 50 records, and Trevor used to come around occasionally. If he couldn't get something, I'd lend it to him. I got no problem with that. I mean, as I say, locally, what Trevor achieved was, I think, was phenomenal. I mean, I was never going to see eye to eye with that setup. But when you think about Stoke-on-Trent back in the day, and you know, I mean, there was clubs all around Stoke-on-Trent. I mean, Burslem, the Magic Roundabout, Burslem, Strikes, DeVille's, you know, clubs all around. The Inset in Stoke, the 72 club in Stoke. There was a club down the side of the bus station in Longton that was playing soul in the late 60s. And nowadays, probably through social media, probably through kids just changing the way they listen to music nowadays. You don't have to go to the record shop, you can stream, you can get music in so many different ways. But back then, you had to give a shit. I would get up at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning, go to London, come back. I'd either do Birmingham or Manchester before I went to Blackpool. So a record that was hitting the deck in Blackpool that night, I'd already been up since 7 o'clock that morning, and that record was going to hit the deck in Blackpool Mecca at that point. And the Old Days the same. The Old Days were a phenomena. Started off really to take effect with the Ritz in Manchester, this combination of Northern Soul and the beginnings of jazz funk. But then around the country, these Old Days were springing up with between 800 and 2,000 people. Birmingham, Locarno, which became the powerhouse. Sheffield, Sheffield was a Tiffany's. They got a Romeo and Juliet's. You got all these things going on all around. Bradford, Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham, Leicester, Nottingham. Nottingham, of course, Palais and Rock City. This heartbeat was incredible. And what you were saying before about, you didn't think that I liked you. You, for me, were fantastic because you brought another element that, I'll be honest, I wouldn't have brought that element into the scene as it was. But I was able to take that element and play it at All Days in Nottingham, in Derby, in Leicester, in Birmingham, and without them having to worry about booking you.
That was what was happening.
And now, of course, he's bought the Colin Curtis beard and hair set, so you know that what I'm saying is true.
I want to change tack a little bit here now. Obviously, nowadays the medium for listening to music and the internet is just limitless. But back then, radio was a big thing. I want you to each tell me, if you can, the impact radio and what particular stations or DJs were a big influence on you at the time. Start with you, Greg, please.
Well, I mean, there used to be a show on Radio Merseyside every Monday night called Keep On Trucking with a DJ called Terry Linane. And when I was 16, 17, I got to know him, and I was going on the station like weekly. I mean, it'd be brilliant. You'd go to the Red Star office at Slime Street, and he'd pick up the new Earth, Wind and Fire. I remember, I think it was All in All, and no one had heard it. CBS had got a few copies in for the radio DJs and Chris Hill and a few others, and that was it. And going back into the station and hearing Fantasy for the first time, and him knowing he's going to play this in a minute and blow people's minds, And so I was involved with that, and my ambition at the time, because being a DJ, the next step in the late 70s was to get on radio. There was no culture the way we know it, where you could, and to get onto these underground scenes you didn't just walk onto them, you had to earn your apprenticeship. So radio was my ambition, and I was kind of primed to take over from Terry. He was supposed to be going to, what it was, there was 2 jobs up at Radio Luxembourg, and Peebles at Piccadilly was one of the people that was wanted for the position, and Linane, and Peebles was the favourite, and if he went, Linane would take over on Manchester on Piccadilly Radio in the days before Mike Shaft. And it never happened. The other 2 DJs got the jobs. Linane stayed in place, and all of a sudden, after being announced as I was going to be his successor, there was no job there, and so I kind of veered off in a different direction then. But Linane, what he was doing on Radio Merseyside was great. Later down the line, of course, Mike Shaft at Piccadilly, and I did my mixes for Mike Shaft. And what I loved about Mike was that when I started doing the mixes and I was starting to play this electronic music, he personally didn't like it. But he was professional enough as a presenter to realise that a lot of the people listening to his show did like it. And although, he wanted to play a more soulful kind of vibe and everything, he would, just like he'd bring in Colin to do jazz breaks and stuff like that. And so I did the mixes for Mike. And that show was like I mean, you had Robbie Vincent and Greg Edwards in London, but those three were the biggest in the country when it came to radio and the influence that they had. So, you know, Shafty was able to spread that message out to a much wider populace. Radio was massively important in that way. So, like with the record, for example, you know, Spinning, the one DJ they wanted to play their record more than anyone else was Mike Shaft, because he played on the radio, and they might be able to order 40 copies the next week or whatever it was because he's played it. So Shaft, I mean, it was like people like Colin or Trevor would be breaking these records in the clubs, and you know, the radio DJs would then be bringing it to the next. And then there'd be certain people who were connected with the more commercial scene, but did have a slight foot in the black. And then the music came through. So some of these tracks were never even released in this country. Some were, they didn't do much in the. Others were big hits, crossover records that, you know, now seem like commercial records, but were once very much underground. And so, you know, radio played a massive role in taking it all to the next stage.
Radio have an impact on you, Trevor?
Definitely. From my point of view, it was Luxembourg. Sunday nights, Luxembourg, without fail. After Luxembourg, it would have to be Robbie Vincent. He was national. I knew about some of the regional people like Mike Shaft, but unfortunately, obviously that signal didn't pull all the way down to Staffordshire. So my mainstay was Robbie Vincent at that particular time. Everything that he brought out, I mean, he was getting everything. Not everything that they were playing down in London automatically worked up in the north. There was a bit of this north-south divide. I don't know if that happened with you guys. Some of the tracks I used to listen to, I thought, oh, I don't think that's going to work, or we tried it, and he said, no. But Robbie Vincent in his heyday, I'm not alone. I'm sure a lot of my colleagues, a lot of the DJs I know, they were listening to him on Sunday night. And how many people used to listen to him, I don't know, but it must have been several million.
Colin, radio.
I wish what you just said was true. There's never been a million listeners to any black music radio station in the UK, I can tell you that for sure. But Robbie Vincent was the most influential. He's the only, even all these years later, 40 odd years later, independent shows, I do them, lots of DJs do them, whether it's podcasts, whether it's radio shows regularly. Nobody gets anywhere like the figures. When Robbie Vincent played records, then people hit the record shops on the Monday morning, you know, for the imports that he was playing. He was the most influential, but the person that got me interested in radio, my main interest was to play records in clubs and watch people's reaction. Go into a club and play music that you knew people had never heard before, and you get a reaction. Radio didn't impress me very much in the early days, but Mike Raven, he was the first one, late 60s. He had an incredible show on the BBC. Pirate radio then took over, so you know, Emperor Roscoe started to appear on Caroline and eventually on the BBC. So that was a breeding ground, and again, it would highlight records to me that probably weren't, if you know, the non-club records, the non-club soul records would be highlighted. And then Robbie Vincent has probably, even to this day, been the most effective black music radio DJ in the UK. Greg Edwards was down there as well, but he never got national. Richard Serling's done a lot of good work on radio up at this end of the country, but radio for me, I did go on to Mike Shaft's show. Mike Shaft was a massive presenter. Before him, of course, it was Andy Peebles, who went on to Top of the Pops. And on the first episode, one of the cameras took a picture of his bald head, and that was the end of his career on Top of the Pops. Don't ask me why. But yeah, radio was playing a massive and a different part to what was going on in the clubs. I eventually worked. Greg's mentioned the main event night, which was sponsored by Piccadilly Radio on a Tuesday night. So they got a Tuesday night with 800,000 people in. And the guy who used to organise my drinks and make sure my microphone was working, make sure all the equipment was okay, was a guy called Gary Davis. Apparently he's a radio DJ. Well, who knew? Gary Davis was actually the nephew of Ivor Abadi. Ivor Abadi, who used to keep the Ghosty Hall in Betley. He owned that. He also owned the Twisted Wheel. He also owned Rufus, which is a club Mike and I did in Manchester. And Gary Davis, a little bit like Bruno Brooks and Bruno's dad. I mean, Bruno's dad was the force to get him on the radio. And yeah, don't get me wrong, Bruno Brooks is a very talented radio DJ. And in the end, so was Gary Davis. He was trying to get him onto Piccadilly. And I remember Gary Davis coming in, he says, I'm not going to be here next week. I said, well, who's going to do my microphone? He said, I've got a job on the radio. I said, you're kidding me. He said, no. He said, I've got a job. I said, what time are you on? He said, I'm on from 2 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock. And I said, that'll go very well. It's going to be smashing. You'll probably notice when it goes dark, people go to bed and go to sleep. But he did a masterstroke. He opened up the telephones and it was like playing Misty for me. All the lonely people in this big city were ringing Gary Davis, and his show became one of the most popular shows on Piccadilly, and eventually got in the job on Radio 1. I heard him the other morning. He still hasn't got any clue at all musically, but he's not a bad radio DJ.
Oh, that's a great story. You've all three of you had long and illustrious careers. This is maybe a difficult question for you because you've played so many venues and you've been through so many decades of different genres within the genres that you play with black music. But what would you say individually was that sort of one venue that was, you know, the best representation of your career back then? Greg?
Easy for me, it's Legend, Manchester, Wednesday nights, 82, 83. Supper Dreams, you know, it's everything you could dream of. I could never have better.
No, because you've got a £500,000 lighting system, you've got an unbelievable sound system, and just, I mean, you've been doing the all days and you've been doing the same as the rest of us, jazz funk, and I mean, you were clever enough to get involved in the jazz stuff as well, the jazz breaks. But then you still haven't got, with the greatest respect, an individual identity as Greg Wilson. But that gave you that identity, and that was for me, that was a brave move that you did, and that brought in a whole raft, particularly black kids in Manchester, but yeah, also the white kids as well. In fact, I still get involved with a few of them. But that opened the door, and I, as I said earlier, that allowed me to take that part of it. I wasn't interested in what Kev Edwards had got to say or what he thought was good or bad. But, you know, in Manchester, I realised there was no point me pursuing that musical side, but took it to Birmingham, took it to, you know, and the electro-funk just went wild.
And what you had in Birmingham, again, what followed through was that it was the venue and the sounds. Legend was just a set apart. And so, and the Pier was great as well, but Legend as a compact club was just amazing. First club with, like, sub-bass, 3 Technics 1200s. They were the first time I'd seen them in a British club. You know, it was just set up for the DJ perfectly, and it was such a great venue. And the crowd that came in, it wasn't just the Manchester kids. They were travelling from, you know, Sheffield, Birmingham, Leeds, Bradford, Stoke, you know, Wolverhampton, all these places on a, you know, Wednesday night and a Tuesday night. A bit like what you said before about the drinks, you know, the black kids didn't have the money to buy drinks. They had enough money maybe to get into the club, but most people drank tap water, or, you know, like kind of what used to have like a fruit juice and put water in on top of that, and so yeah, so you know, it was. I mean, in fact, when I look at it historically and a lot of the things that are in the book and a lot of the scenes that are in the book, there's a real common denominator. Most of these great clubs and scenes, there wasn't people drinking. There was no drinking.
No. That's been an issue all the time. So it's you now.
Mine's definitely going to be the place. I had 10 very good years there. Through them years, the crowd that visited, if you visited at any one time, it was absolutely amazing in there. It was only a small venue, but really left a mark on my life. Everything else has sprouted from there. People know me from the place. You did that, you did this. We're going to the all days, but that nightclub certainly put me on the map with regards to Staffordshire, Stoke-on-Trent. And no, it was just a fantastic time in my life.
I suppose for you, Colin, it's not it's not an obvious answer really, because I think if someone was to answer for you, on obviously not necessarily the correct answer, but they would assume Blackpool Mecca. But what was special for you that you feel was the highlight of your career back then?
You've got one of each really. I mean, for Northern Soul, it'd be the Golden Torch, Tunstall. I mean, there was nothing like that. There was nowhere like that. For the more modern end of what was Northern Soul, when we started playing records by Gil Scott-Heron and Donald Byrd, and you know, the evolution of jazz, funk and rap even, that would be Blackpool Mecca. For jazz dance, it would probably be Birmingham, Locarno in the jazz room. There was nowhere like that either. You'd see dancers that by today's standards would be earning thousands of pounds because they were that good. So Birmingham for the jazz, yeah. All Dayers, too many, isn't there? You know, I mean, the Ritz was incredible. Birmingham Locarno was incredible. Nottingham was very lucky there too. The Palais, and then eventually Rock City. So when you think, you just take Rock City for instance, you talk about musical development. At Rock City we had artists like Kenny Burke, M2 May, but we also had Mantronics, we also had Run DMC, we also had Africa Bambaataa, you know, Public Enemy were on there, yeah, that's right. In fact, Mantronics at the end of the set came to the DJ box and he wanted to buy the Technics turntables because they couldn't get them in America. So we got him a taxi.
I thought you would have said, though, Colin, I thought you would have said Berlin as one of your...
Yeah, the reason I didn't say Berlin is because Berlin was probably multicultural and multi-music. Berlin was the first club that I went into to DJ for more than, you know, alternative sets all night. So Berlin, I would play for 4 or 5 hours. So I'd take 4 of those big Tesco crates full of vinyl. I got no friends on a Tuesday, nobody wanted to help. Nobody wanted, do you want to lift? No thanks, it's Tuesday. I'm not carrying them in boxes. But in Berlin, we had this tapestry. Tuesday night was also a big night for the Apollo, so I was lucky enough, we had Maze in there, we had, you know, a lot of the major acts would then come on, Thompson Twins came down, but almost every week, Mick Hucknall was there out of Simply Red. Dean Johnson, who was eventually the manager of Expansion Records and became an influential DJ in Manchester. But this allowed me to mix up jazz with hip hop, with soul, all in one club, which was, at the time, nobody was doing it. And this one week, the bouncer came down to me, he said, I've got a little kid at the door. He says, you know him, can he come in? He says he looks about 12. I said, go and ask him his name. And he came back, he says his name's Giles. I said, Giles Peterson that? I said, yeah, just let him in. And at that point, Giles Peterson had never seen a club like Berlin. And if you ask him now to this day, that was one of the major influences in his DJ career, when he saw someone mixing up all those different styles of music. I still work with Giles, I still do the Way Out Here Festival. I work with the Disco King himself, Joey Negro, who allowed me to put jazz compilations out on a disco label, which is great fun. But yeah, Berlin was unique because we got a mixture of young black kids, old black kids, you know, for reggae guys who would come in just to smoke dope up the corner because it was dark. 2 or 3, 4 weeks in, were coming up to me and saying, hey man, you give me some of that jazz tapes. and let me tell you, these guys were 6 foot tall, so they got jazz tapes every time they fucking asked. But that, yeah, in terms of moving forward for people like Peterson, I mean, you know, Dr. Bob Jones, 1 or 2 other DJs, Paul Murphy you mentioned. Paul Murphy was an Irish guy who just grabbed jazz by the balls in London and dragged it into the 100 Club, he dragged it into Electric Ballroom, into the Horseshoe. And again, Giles Peterson picked up off him. That was another massive influence for Giles. But it's been a ride. But for me, Stoke-on-Trent has always been a working class city. It's always like black music, it's always like rock music. But just at the moment, you know, to come into, no disrespect to this club, but to come to a night like this, and no disrespect to anyone who's here, but I mean, in the times that we were talking about, we would have sold this place out in 60 minutes. You know, it is a completely different world now. There's so many more choices. I've got 4 kids. None of them are obsessed with the music that I play. None of them. They're all great kids, and one of them may even turn up here tonight. But it's, for me, this is a ride that I can't get off. I'm going to keep on doing it.
Obviously, everyone associates DJing with playing music, very, very obvious, but I think certainly with the higher profile DJs, there's usually other strings to the bow, and obviously touching on you, Greg, that documenting the history and obviously explaining to people, you know, what you do is a big part of DJ culture. You had a little bit of a break from your DJ career, which for someone who was only a child back then, listening to that kind of music, finds it really sort of unbelievable to think that you weren't actually out in the club playing records during that period. What were you doing in that period?
Production, or trying to get projects going, on a roller coaster of sometimes things went well, managed the Rap Assassins and produced them 2 albums for EMI. Other times I'm looking down the back of my couch for some change to get some cigs or whatever, you know, from the shop. You know, I was just really down, really down on my luck. And so it was, you know, once I came away from it and unhooked myself from that life, put myself into the world of trying to get record deals and stuff like that, it's a very precarious world, you know, and so I eventually came back to DJing in early 2000s and 2003. What brought me back in really was the internet. Once I started looking at the internet and realising history was being documented, so club culture, and there were also books that were obviously being written and stuff, and what I could see in there, that all this that we're talking about was hardly mentioned. It was an afterthought, and it's almost like the way I see it now is that we look at it in this country that we had 2 great dance cultures. We had Northern Soul and we had rave, but we didn't. We had 3 great dance cultures. We had jazz funk, and that going into electro funk. We had what we call the black scene. You know, we had that scene, and that had so much influence on what was going on. That influenced the whole thing from a dance perspective. We can see where the origins of house music in this country emerged from. You know, we can see these patterns, you know, we can see why it's different from America, that we didn't just copy what was happening in America in the 70s once we started learning a bit more. We had our own lineage that dated back, you can go before the early 60s, you can go back into the wartime when the black GIs were coming over and stuff. There's been an obsession with black music in this country for a long time, which kind of created, I mean, for example, I don't think rave could have happened anywhere but in this country, because for me it's almost the collision of a British lineage with the American way of doing it, and it kind of perfectly kind of touches at a certain place in time, and that's why it emerged here and not back in the States, so to speak, on that level. So yeah, you know, I mean, everything kind of connects with everything else. Like I said with the book, it's a web of information of different things, and I've tried to write it in a way that connects as many things as possible and gives you enough information that if you're interested in a certain aspect, that you've got the internet now, you can explore, and there's so much you can do with that. So it's a primer in a way, and hopefully a fun one as well that people can enjoy, you know, and it's not a heavy thing, but there is a hell of a lot of information in there and a hell of a lot of connections with regards to what went before.
I've got to say, if you've not read the book, you really should try and take the opportunity to get it. It's a really, really good book, I've got to say. Just going back to Colin and Trevor, obviously in that period I was mentioning where sort of Greg was, you know, into production and management and wasn't really DJing. You guys were continuing DJing, and really house music become so dominant at the time. How did you feel about that? Because obviously you were still, you know, playing the genres that you'd always been in love with, but because house music became so dominant, did you find it difficult?
I certainly didn't. I just thought I was young enough to sort of embrace what was coming through, and I just saw it as something that was evolving. Whilst I was at the place, we were getting the first bits of house. You got Adonis, No Way Back. Things were changing, the tempo was going up. And one thing I was noticing, we used to get quite a few visitors coming from Manchester, and I think one particular night it didn't go too well down in the basement, in so much as that the music was evolving, and then we got the start of acid, and we were playing one or two tracks which didn't work, and I thought we'll look a bit further into this. So I went up to Leadbellies, I think it was up in Sheffield, and just had a look at the scene up there and seeing how it was evolving, and I pulled up outside Leadbellies, and there must have been a queue of about 250 people.
Was that the Lead Mill?
Lead Mill, yeah.
Leadbellies.
That's Hanley.
I thought it was old people who suffered from that.
Yeah, it certainly opened my eyes with regards to sort of the pattern of how the music was changing, and said, how am I going to sort of embrace this and bring it on to the people in Staffordshire? After the place closed in the late 1980s, I then went on to Evergreens, and basically I was allowed to sort of do what I wanted to do. On the back of that, you got things like Voodoo Ray. There's a lot of the early house sign. We had a captive audience. It was open 7 nights a week. We had a lot of people in there. I was also able to play my soul and R&B, anything that was coming out that I felt that would sort of fit in. I was to shoe that in and also embrace all the new house styles that were coming through. And we had fantastic times down there. The music, it just evolved. And I was quite surprised with the amount of people that used to go to the place basement, and I never published that I was working down at Evergreens, but I didn't think they would embrace it as much. But we had full house virtually 5 nights a week down there, and we were playing the early parts of house music.
What about you, Colin? House music, obviously, that was something that you were on from day one, literally. I love it when sort of, people like to point out where sometimes, particularly on the internet, there's a very Mancunian attitude that they invented house music in the north of England, which I do like, and I'm on board because I know what the Londoners are like, telling everyone that they invented it. But I like to think that there's a piece of Stoke-on-Trent within Manchester that was leading that charge.
Definitely. I mean, when they write articles about Manchester, they write about the Playpen, which is the first place that I was playing house music. And but if you push forward to '86, there was a weekender that I did down in Bognor Regis with Chris Hill, with Giles Peterson, Clear with a band that were on live. They were one of the biggest soul funk bands at the time, and I was playing what I called house music, and again, another little story. I started having what people now know as panic attacks. They're great panic attacks. I had no idea what it was, thought I was having a heart attack, and I got the ambulance out to the site. And he said, no, he said, there's nothing up with you, just, it's some sort of panic attack, okay? And then the next knock on the door, this bloke said, I've got a chap here who wants to have a look at your records. I said, yeah, all right. I said, what's his fucking name? He says, Paul Oakenfold. I said, right. And so I said, well, I didn't know this guy. So he came in and he went through my boxes and where have you got this from, where have you got that from, where have you got the other from? I said, well, that's from Chicago, that's from New York, that's from... Well, where did you buy this music? I said, well, if you're asking questions like that, you need to fucking sort your life out, pal. Go and find some fucking music yourself. This is my job. But of course, he did that very well, made himself a multi-millionaire. So it seems that I'm able to touch people and then they go and make money. I need to reverse that fucking shit. But house music, for me, the parallel was that this was up-tempo dance music. The lyrics and the message that it was sending were the same message that got me into 60s soul, So the connection between Northern Soul and house music for me was massive. This is people talking about the lives, talking about poor folks, talking about the whole system against blacks in America, the whole system, you know, the same stories, but also adding the love stories because that sells records as well. So house music for me was just a natural progression. You know, some of the early things that Trevor's on about, you know, the acid house that was coming out of Chicago, again, a reaction to what was going on in the cities, a minimal sound, but just an absolutely fantastic sound, which developed into Greg Wilson's electro-funk. And, you know, what Greg did as well is to achieve a comeback on the scale that he did. He dropped out, you've intimated you dropped out for a few years. You dropped out for how many years?
20.
20 years. You see, I thought we'd
I was
fucking
trying to
got
be
rid of him.
polite for you.
I really thought we'd fucking got rid of him, but no. He's back, Greg Wilson. And then, that's quite right. Then the phone rang, and this guy on the end of the phone says, "Hi, this is Greg Wilson." I said, "No, Greg Wilson's dead." And we spoke for nearly 3 hours, I think, that day, and we put right a few of the misconceptions.
And I recorded it all, and it didn't record.
There was too much swearing anyway, so it wouldn't. But, you know, to reinvent himself and be accepted all over the world, you know, and quite rightly, and to go out now onto the festivals and to be able to open people's minds again, I think what he's achieved is absolutely phenomenal.
I think we've just got 5 minutes left. I just want to sum up really. I want to thank everyone really for coming tonight. Stuff like this really documenting, particularly for people from Stoke-on-Trent and having Colin and Trevor in here, and obviously big guests such as Greg. You know, I just want to thank everyone. I really do. Thank you. Obviously, don't want this to go in a morbid direction, but obviously you guys someday are going to come to the end of your career. I'm just curious to think, how will you look back on each of your individuals' careers, and how will you sort of view them? I know that's a difficult question to ask.
I knew you were asking.
I'm asking you, Greg.
How will we look back on
Your individual. Why will you look back on your career?
Well, yeah, you know, I mean, I what I've tried to do in this second career, so to speak, is point back to what went before, but avoid doing that in a nostalgic way. I'm not interested in nostalgia for the sake of it, but it's great in terms of informing people about what went before and seeing how cycles emerge and stuff. And I think if you don't have you know, if you have no understanding of what went before, you can never have an understanding what might happen in the future, because you see these cycles. And so something like this, where you have a whole chunk of history of dance culture in this country that's been undervalued and missed out, it leaves a gap. It leaves a massive gap in people's knowledge that on a basic level becomes the what I call the Ibiza myth, that people believe house came back from Ibiza. And you know, it's you can't blame them really, because the story's told about the DJs going out and hearing Alfredo and this Balearic sound and taking ecstasy and bringing that thing back. But what they didn't realise was that the house was already in place. The music was already in place. What Ibiza did, it brought back a Balearic spirit. It certainly brought back ecstasy, and that revolutionised dance culture. So obviously it was massively, massively important. But you can't give it credit for what it didn't do, and that certainly wasn't house music. And so in the North and the Midlands, like we've spoken here, house music was a direct continuation of electro. Different lineage in the South, because rare groove was such a big thing. And so house music mainly came out of the gay clubs within the South. People like Mark Moore and those people, Colin Favor, they were playing that house stuff, but it wasn't being played so much within the black music scene, and that was all cultivated here. So when people talk about, when they say about Manchester being ahead of London, I think Manchester's just chosen because it was the central point. It's the North and the Midlands, because, you know, what was happening in Manchester was happening in Birmingham, was happening in Leeds. This was the connected scene through the all-dayers. We didn't do all-dayers in London. That was a separate kind of side of it, but the North meant north of Watford. You know, it meant the Midlands, it meant the north. And so that whole scene was cultivated here very naturally from what had gone before. It was just part of the same lineage, where London is a bit different. So I think it was confused at that point, and it felt, to a lot of people who were writing about dance music for the first time at that point, people I know, you know, work for certain magazines that were into indie music, who didn't have any time for black dance music, but all of a sudden they popped a little pill, and now this was great, and now they were telling us what dance music was. And I think that was the confusion, and this Ibiza story was so overplayed that even now a lot of people think that's the origins of how, just like Berlin now, that people think Berlin is the origins of techno. People don't realize anything about Detroit. They think Berlin is techno, younger people. And so these things get a disconnect at certain times. And that's what I'm trying to do, is bridge that disconnect and give people an insight into what was happening that hasn't been really talked about properly.
I think that's very important. I hope, obviously, you do more writing, Greg. And obviously, anyone, as I say, books are here for sale, obviously. If you want Greg to sign one, also he will. Obviously, we haven't gone into sort of a Q&A. I'd have to get down and start individual asking questions. But if you've got any questions, obviously, for Greg, you know, we're going to have a couple of records now from Matt, and then obviously Trevor's going to go on in a sec. After Trevor, we've got Colin. After Colin, we've got Greg. And then after Greg, we've got Mr. Pete Bromley at the back, finishing off the night. Again, without repeating myself too much, thank you everyone for coming tonight.